Good morning. We're in Ayin Beis, page 1157, volume 2, at the top of page 1157. And we're discussing the difference between Oir and Yesh, in the context that Oir, the very existence and definition and identity of Oir Ein Sof, which is so fundamental in Chassidus and in Kabbalah, is essentially a non-conscious entity. What I mean by non-conscious means it doesn't have any self-value. Its whole metzius, its whole existence is bittul to its source. And that bittul, we said there are 4 levels, and the lowest level is heder tfisas mokim, being that it feels its source and is connected to it. All its entire identity is a reflection of its source. Yesh does not have that. Yesh does not reflect its source. You can deduce intellectually that ein dover esa sasme, that nothing creates itself, and therefore there is a creator. But there's nothing about the yesh in its hergish, in our feeling, that we feel I'm connected to something. Yes, if you work at it, you can sense there's a higher reality and that you originate from it, but it's not easily identifiable and on its own. It needs work. Whereas Oir, its whole identity is the bittul to its source. So to say that existence, Yesh, the Yesh HaNivra, is a state of bittul, of heder tfisas mokim, any level of bittul for that matter, no, it's not there until there's avodah. That's not the way it was created. Yes, it's true that the Yesh reveals to us something about Atzmus that the Oir does not reveal, which is Mitziyusim Atzmusei. But that also is through our intellectual process. Not because we feel that. That's the whole point of the Yesh, is that it itself feels that it doesn't have a il of a siba. It has no cause. That's why the Alter Rebbe says in Nageres HaKedesh, Simon Chav 20, that where can that come from, such a feeling? It only can come from Atzmus. Because only Asmus can create something that should have a feeling that it does not indicate to any source. But Oir is the exact opposite. Oir only has a source. It doesn't have anything of its own. And yet, from the perspective of Asmus is as distant from Oir as it is from Yesh. Because Asmus is not defined by Gilui, as we learned at length. So then the question is, what means heder tfisas mokim? What does it mean that it doesn't have any self-value? You can say that one level of Gili took another level of Gili. So the answer that he's been building up, and we're now going to conclude the actual answer, is that Oir, though from a perspective of Atzmus, Oir and Yesh are equally distant, like he said, mamish. The bottom of page 1155, he said that that's from the perspective of Atzmus. But from the perspective of Oir has nothing else but Atzmus. So though, yes, does Oir reveal all of Atzmus? No. Does it reveal the true nature of Atzmus? No. But from the point of view of Oir has no other reality except Atzmus. And that's where there's the uniqueness of Oir, and of course, that's why Oir is so important, because it carries the message to us that there's nothing but Atzmus. In this context, there's no tfisas mokim. It doesn't have any value in the presence of Atzmus. But I don't want to jump. We're going to read it inside. But before that, in order to understand this, that how on one hand, the Oir is ein arech to Atzmus. On the other hand, it's efen heisavus. He says, its manner of creation is not, its manner of emerging is not in the form of ein arech, because it's a revealing force. I'll say the revealing doesn't reveal Atzmus, so it's ein arech, but the fact that Oir is nothing but Elikus and batel to Elikus makes it have something in common with Atzmus, in the sense, not in common with its personality, but in common with the idea that there's nothing but godliness. So if you want to put it in different words, you can say, Oir, in the world of Metzias Nimtza, you have something that's completely batel to the Atzmus, which is built in Metzias Nimtza. even though he doesn't use those words here, and I hesitate using it, but let's not even use those words. In the world of Metzias Nimsa, you have something that's completely bottled to God. In psychological terms, you could perhaps say that in the state of consciousness, even though it is not really consciousness, but relative to Atzmus, it's already a conscious entity, meaning not self-conscious, not as independent conscious. In the world of consciousness, you have something that's completely subjugated to the source, which will then give the power to consciousness that will emerge after the tzimtzum of a yesh and a nivra that will have its own independent consciousness. So that independent consciousness came from a consciousness that was not independent, which therefore serves as an interface to connect it back to the source itself, which is beyond conscious altogether and beyond superconscious. You could also say a different way that perhaps Eir Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, especially Eir Atzmi that he's talking about here, the higher levels of Eir, well, I'm not sure if he's Eir Atzmi, but it's definitely the higher levels of Eir, is perhaps superconsciousness. And it's a superconscious state that's completely committed and dedicated to its source. And that will ultimately allow consciousness to also experience that. So that's an explanation of Eir. So to explain it, he said, let's talk about Ratzon and Seichel. And we actually finished that topic. So let me sum that up. Ratzon and Seichel are two forces that come from the Nefesh. So from one perspective, they're both not the Nefesh itself, not Etzem HaNefesh. They're not the core soul. They're both faculties, but they're very different types of faculties. One is a specific faculty that's not, you can't say it's a reflection of the soul. You could say it's an expression of the soul. You can say it's a particular faculty of the soul, but it's very defined. It's not an expression of like revealing whatever the soul wants is not expressed through Seichel. Seichel is one of the things that the soul, one of the faculties of the soul, just like Midas is a faculty. The second point is that the way Seichel emerges from the soul is also B'derech Nivdal, like he said. B'derech Nivdal means that even though it originates in higher levels, the revealed intelligence comes from concealed intelligence, Koyach HaMaskil, which in turn, beyond that is the Koyach Hiyuli, Koyach HaSeichel Hiyuli Ha'atzmi, a core essential state. At the same time, however, the way Seichel emerges from there is B'derech Nivdal as a separate entity. It doesn't flow freely. It's not like Seichel is attached to it and Seichel can access it, not in intelligent way, and not in our intelligence and not through emotion. So he said like this, that from the Koyach Hiyuli Ha'atzmi, like a flintstone, sparks come, but the sparks don't exist as sparks inside the stone. It's only when you strike it. When you talk about a hot coal, you only have to fan it, blow on it. The flame is inside the coal, and the flame then emerges. Even though he doesn't say it here explicitly in Tzadik Dalet, he'll say this is the difference between Koyach HaMaskil and the Koyach Hiyuli Ha'atzmi. That the flintstone is more like the Koyach Hiyuli Ha'atzmi, Seichel Hiyuli Ha'atzmi. And the coal is more like the Koyach HaMaskil. But even the Koyach HaMaskil, he said that, so from the Koyach Hiyuli, for sure Seichel is a leap. Even from the Koyach HaMaskil, he said it also is essentially a leap, as he explained, because we feel there's a source, but we don't feel what the source is like, and we don't understand the source. As opposed to Yesh, like I mentioned before, Yesh completely doesn't have any relation, doesn't even feel that there's a source. Ratzon, on the other hand, also has these two dimensions. Ratzon also originates in the soul. There's the Koyach HaRatzon, that's the regular flow where Ratzon comes from, like the equivalent to Koyach HaMaskil. There's the Koyach HaRatzon Hiyuli, in the Nefesh itself, the Koyach Atzmi of Ratzon, that essential core faculty. And there too, you can't call that central core faculty, the Hiyuli, a Mokir. He says you can't call it a Mokir. You could say Ratzon emerges from there, but you can't call it a source because it's beyond any defined desire. It's the power of desire. Or even better, the potential capacity for desire. Then you have the potential for desire as the Koyach HaRatzon. Then you have the actual desire. But here, even though there's also these both ways, which I should also mention is Er Yosher and Er Chezer, from the koyach harotzen, or from the koyach hamaskel comes yasher, comes the regular flow of a desire or of an intelligence. Chezer digs deeper and reaches deeper because it comes through some resistance, some concealment. In the seichel, through a question or a student. In rotzen, due to being compelled or kabbalah seil, that the rotzen doesn't come easily, but once it's revealed, it comes with much more intensity because it's coming from a far deeper place. So in that, both seichel and rotzen have these two stages. Before the revealed faculty comes the concealed faculty and the potential capacity of the faculty. Let's put it that way, from the nefesh. But here's the key difference. Seichel comes in Eifin Nivdal as a separate entity. Why? Because just as it's a separate entity, it's one faculty of the soul, so the process of how it emerges is also as a separate thing, and it does not relate directly to the source. Meaning, you cannot trace, when you're using seichel, you can't say, oh, I feel the source of my seichel, the superconscious source, or I feel the koyach hiyuli atzmi. No, that's all beyond you. In Ratzon, on the other hand, Ratzon's domain is reflection of the soul. Since Ratzon's inyan is not a particular faculty, in other words, it's not focused on the product, but on the producer. Remember, like the ayin of the yesh amiti, as opposed to the ayin of the yesh nivra. So seichel and all the faculties is the product. That's the faculty. Intelligence, emotions, and so on. Chochma, bina, das, chesed, gvura. When it comes to Ratzon, Ratzon doesn't have an identity of its own. It's not a specific faculty. All it is the desire, the ispashtus as a nefesh, like he said, the expression and the reflection and expression and extension, ispashtus nefesh of the nefesh, like I gave the example with the chief of staff. So therefore, the way Ratzon emerges from the nefesh, from the hiyuli atzmi, from the seichel, from the Ratzon hiyuli ha'atzmi, the capacity of desire, as well as the power of desire, koyach haratzon, whether it's yasher or chezer or yasher, it's not in a form of nivdal. Not in a form of nivdal and richuk, because all it is a reflection of its source. Now, this is going to be the basis of answering the question or explaining Oyer. So let's read till the end of the paragraph. Then I'm going to explain a big question I asked yesterday. What do you need this whole piece? Hypothetically, if you took away this whole example of Ratzon and Seichel, why can't Rebbe Rashab say the same idea without Ratzon and Seichel? What is it adding to the picture? And I want to share a few thoughts on that. But before we do, let's now use this. Now he's going to go back and say how it is regarding Ur. So he says the same thing now.
A question.
I'm reading on page 1157. The line begins, Mitziyusem in etzem.
A question possible?
Let me first finish this, then your last question, if you don't mind. Okay.
All right.
I'm going to flow here, and I want to make sure it's seamless without going. So I'm going to say like this. So hold your question, please. Okay. So on page 1157, if you need the actual text and you don't have it, you go to ayinbeis.com. It's all there, PDFs of this. Okay. So now he says, Val derech ze yuvan. Remember the beginning of the paragraph on last page, top of the page, Yesh levaya zeh. He came to explain what zeh, came to explain how Ur, even though it's ein areich to Asmus, is infinitely distant to Asmus, just like Yesh. At the same time, however, its havus is not b'derech ein areich. The process of how it emerges is not through a leap; it's through revelation. So it's a leap in the quality of the Ur. In other words, the identity of the Ur is obviously infinitely distant from Asmus, but its manner of production, so to speak, the way it emerges and the way it was brought into being is b'derech kiruv. Or actually not b'derech richuk would be the right way, because it reveals. At the end of the day, all it is a reflection of Asmus. And he's using Ratzon now as an example. So he says, Val derech zeh yuvan b'bchinas ha'metzias ha'er min ha'atzmus. Al derech zeh, that which we just said, similar to what we just said, the difference between desire, which is a revelation and reflection of the nefesh, in contrast to seichel, which is not a revelation of the nefesh, it's a revelation from the nefesh. meaning a particular function. She says, Al derech ze yuvan, will also understand that the Metzias ha'er, the existence of Oir from Atzmus. The ima yesha Atzmus muvdal be'erech min ha'er, even though Atzmus is separate, be'erech, relatively, and here it means really, meaning infinitely, from the Oir, because Atzmus and Oir have nothing in common. From the Atzmus point of view, Atzmus is a core essence. Oir is a reflection, and even as a reflection, you can't call Atzmus a mo'er, a source like light and sunlight and the sun. It's a new expression, but the same idea. And it's not shaykh, it's not possible, not applicable at all. Completely not in the realm of saying that Atzmus is b'chinas kiruv, is close to lahamtzi davar, to bring anything into being. Atzmus is not a source for something. It's a self-contained, core, essential entity that's completely different than anything. It can create anything. Everything can emerge from it, but you can't define it as a source to something. You could say, in Ilav Ol, starting from Ilav Ol, you could say, a cup of water came from a pitcher of water. A pitcher of water came from a reservoir. It came from the rivers, from the sky, from the rain, wherever. Even when you talk about higher levels, like he said, not Ilav Ol, even Seichel and the Koyach HaMaskil. The Koyach HaMaskil, you may not understand the source, but the Koyach HaMaskil is absolutely a mocker for Seichel. That's its role. It's not a self-contained Atzmi, it's Koyach HaMaskil, the power to conceive ideas. Even Seichel Yulia Atzmi, you can't call it a mocker like Koyach HaMaskil, but still from there originates everything. And you can access it through Ur Chayzer, through Hakah, through striking it, through Yegiya, through effort after there's a question or resistance. Atzmus, you can't use any of these terms. You can't even say it's not a mocker. So it's not just not. Now, of course, you say Mimcha Hakol, everything comes from Atzmus. But that doesn't mean, since everything comes from Atzmus, doesn't mean Atzmus is a mocker for everything, with the word mocker meaning an identifiable source, because that would create some commonality. So even though Atzmus is muvdal, is separate from and you can't call Atzmus a source for anything. It's not in a form of kiruv. B'kol mokim, nevertheless, Metzias se'er mina Atzmus. See, he said all that from the perspective of Atzmus. But the Metzias se'er mina Atzmus, the way existence of comes from Atzmus, hu loy b'bchinas richuk, is not in a form of richuk. In other words, even though Atzmus is completely removed, and you can't call it in any form of closeness, but the way Atzmus chose to express is in the form that should be. That's why he says in the parentheses, Valkenu b'chinas that should be a reflection of himself. So despite all this distance, the bottom line is its properties is reflection, is revelation, not distance. In other words, it reveals that it has a source. Is it completely, infinitely apart from the source? Yes. Can Atzmus be called a source? No. But the way is a revealing force, period. That's why it says, Al-Kenu b'chinas. That's why it's That's the actual definition of Now you have to keep in mind, here should not be confused with our imagination of what light is. This isn't sunlight, it's not daylight, it's not candlelight. Light here really means reveal, a revealing force. So could have Atzmus created existence without Of course. But then there would be no revealing element in existence. Everything would be a product, creation. There'd be no concept of revelation. It would be like living in the dark. Can Atzmus do that? Of course he could do that. Now, does that make light more Atzmus than darkness? No. But light, once it does emerge, like we learned many times, that even though is infinitely distant from Atzmus, but once it does, and doesn't have to be created, God does not need to radiate. He has the capacity to radiate, to illuminate, to reveal. He has the capacity not to reveal. But once he does manufacture light, so to speak, once light does emerge, the way it emerges is as a revealing force of what comes above it. Now, without the yesh, we'll never know how ein arech atzmus is. So it reveals that something put it there. Reveals there's a source, because doesn't have any identity of its own. But to appreciate what atzmus is, there you need the products. There you need the yesh and the ein arech that only the yesh reveals, and so only the yesh teaches us about, and so on. But basically, without we don't have consciousness. We don't have awareness. We don't have light. So light here means revelation. And as such, revelation by definition is a kiruv. Or what he calls it, what the word he used here? He doesn't say kiruv. It's not in a form of richuk, it's a form of revealing, not a form of a leap. Tzimtzum is a leap. Yesh is a leap. Any form of concealment is a leap. Revelation is not a leap, is basically what he's saying. But again, not a leap does not mean that it's closer to Atzmus. It means its personality reflects nothing but Atzmus. And you can't say that on lower levels than Ur. Only on Ur. Ur is the only entity that has that type of property and identity, that all it is revealing that it has a source. Okay. Al-Kain, and therefore, I'm sorry, I skipped the line. Sorry. And that's, now he's going to explain the head that tfisas smokim. Because of this, because all is completely consumed with its source. And again, source, quote unquote source, not a source, a real source. But from the point of view of all it is a complete bittul, like rotzen to the nefesh, to atzmus. That's why shayach leme ba'er shay de hergesha atzmus, that by feeling its source, atzmus hariyum is battle ba'atzmuse, it becomes nullified fundamentally at its core. That it absolutely has no sense of its own value at all. Doesn't have any sense of value. Being that this is in the highest possible level, not possible. These are the most increasingly highest levels. Therefore, this that we say about that it's not in a state of distance from Atzmus, because it's a revealing force. How does it maspik? That's enough to say that the hergesha Atzmus who b'chinas hedet tfisas mokim. That through sensing Atzmus, its source, it's in a state of hedet tfisas mokim, lack of standing, lack of value, legamri completely, shemizbat legamri be'etzem uhusei. That is completely nullified in its core essence. This finishes the first level of bittul. You'll see the next paragraph starts with Ayin Beis. That's the second level. Okay, what did he add with this last line? Let's figure that out. I can speculate a few things. You know what? I'm going to peek into Tzadik Daled. Let me see if he says something here that helps understand this line. I don't want, instead of me guessing, might as well look. It says, give me 1 second. He doesn't add anything here, actually. He repeats exactly what it says, but maybe in the, let me see. Okay, so then I'll take a stab at it. So let's explain exactly what this means. How does this help us in answering the question? Since the question was, if you remember, Atzmus is higher than Ur. On page 1155, he asked the question, Atzmus hari l'mayla b'chinas gili. He's higher than Gili. So how do you say Hedet Tfisas Mokim? Hedet Tfisas Mokim, you could say the light of the flame, Shraga, B'tira Mayahana. The light of a flame in the presence of the light of the sun, the bright sunlight or the bright daylight, Mayahana, what benefit does it provide? Because a little light compared to that light is completely nullified. Not only nullified, it's even darkened. Like he said about Keser Elyon, Uchamhu, Kodem Ilis HaIlis. It's dark compared to the cause of causes. So that makes sense. One student, a great teacher, in the presence of his greater teacher, is nullified. It's a common experience. How do you say that with Oyer and Atzmus? That was his initial. One second. Let me finish it. I'll take questions, but just let me finish the idea completely, and then you'll ask your questions. So his answer is, though the answer is ostensibly, apparently, that Oyer has something unique. Being that Oyer is not in the form of Richuk from Atzmus. If you said the Yesh has no Tfisas Mokim, doesn't make sense anyway. So forget about that, because the Yesh doesn't have any sense of its source. But Oyer, it's not just Lagabe higher levels than Oyer, because Oyer, all it is a expression of what Atzmus wants to express, meaning it's a revealing element. So therefore, its entire entity is bittul to Atzmus. And as such, therefore, that sense makes it feel completely valueless or completely no standing. That's Bapashta's explanation of what he's saying here. In other words, we have to understand what Oyer is. Since Oyer is completely dedicated to Atzmus, so that alone makes it in a state of Heder Tfisas Mokim. So it doesn't matter that Atzmus is completely infinitely distant. That's not relevant here. The mere fact that Oyer is completely dedicated and completely committed, has no identity, but revealing what its source is, whatever that source is, that creates Heder Tfisas Mokim. That's what he seems to be saying. Like he said about Rotzen, that it's a level of Ayin, because Rotzen doesn't have its own identity. All it is, like the chief of staff, is dedicated to its source. So it doesn't matter that the chief of staff is infinitely distant from the king. That's not relevant here. What's relevant here is that whatever the Oyer is, whatever the chief of staff or the Rotzen or the Oyer is nothing but connected to its source, and therefore it doesn't have any standing and value. So it could be what he's saying now in those last two lines, not could be, it seems to be that's what he's saying. So here it's not relevant whether you appreciate whether Atzmus is infinitely distant. The key thing here is, that's what he says, since we're talking about the highest levels of Oyer, so the fact that it's not in the form of Richuk because it's close, like the chief of staff sees the king all the time, every day. In this case, the Oyer is completely committed and completely attached to its source, from its point of view, that alone is enough to create a type of complete nullification. So, for example, the Secretary of State or the Chief of Defense or whatever other department in the empire, they have a bittul, but it's from a distance because they don't see the king, they don't see the leader. The Chief of Staff is in his presence all the time. So even though the king, from his perspective, the Chief of Staff is equal to all the heads of the departments and actually to all the subjects of his empire, but from the point of view of the Chief of Staff, the fact is he's constantly in the presence of Atzmus, meaning he has no other role to play but reveal whatever Atzmus wants to reveal. So that property makes him being completely nullified because he's in the presence, so to speak. He's like in the inner sanctum. And that's the Heder Tfisas Mokim. That's how I would explain these last lines. Now, I wanted to explain why he brings Rotzen and Seichel to explain all of this, but that I can wait for a moment. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. And then I'm going to try to explain why did the Rebbe Rashab so important to bring Rotzen and Seichel here. I think it's very vital to the whole development of the interface theme in Ayin Beis. And I'll explain that shortly. So the floor is yours now.
Uh, we just said that Atzmos doesn't have a gil. It's not a, is doesn't have a gili. The only gili, the gili it's using is or. So it's not a question of was it with Akum the small torch and against the big fire, because that small torch is what Atzmos is using, and that's his only identity. And there's no.
That's not, where did you get that? No, who says it's his only identity? His only identity of Ur or of Atzmus?
Sure. The
Okay,
whole thing,
exactly.
he's
That's
a perfect shliach. That's all he cares about is the lighting, and he's not up against the big flame, because he's the flame that Atzmos is giving. There's no problem with that at all. I just was talking about the mushroom you were talking about.
No, fine, correct. Here it's not about light to, it's not, in other words, it's not the head that tfisas smokim of a smaller light to a bigger light, is the head that tfisas smokim of a completely dedicated servant to its master, essentially, if you want to put it that way. Exactly. I don't want to use the word servant because Ur is not really used for servant, but Ur is it's complete bittul to Atzmus. Yes, correct. That's the word here. So in other words, it's an additional way of explaining Tfisas Mok on a very high levels. Basically, in other words, it's not about how infinite Atzmus is from Ur. It's from Ur's perspective, it has nothing but Atzmus. Atzmus is far beyond Ur, but Ur has nothing but Atzmus. Let's put it that way. And therefore, it has this head of Tfisas Mok. Yeah, correct. Anyway, Yecheskel, you wanted to ask something? We can't hear you. You're on mute.
Sorry. I'm going to hold back for a little bit until I figure out exactly what I want to ask you.
Okay, fine. So now I'm going to, let me go back now to the whole explanation here. I was wondering right from the outset, why is the Rebbe Rashab insisting on going into Rotzen and Seichel? And not only that, he went into Yosher and Chezer. And you have to wonder, what is it relevant here? You know, here we're trying to explain how is completely nullified in the presence of Atzmus, though it's infinitely distant. So, okay, fine, you want to explain Rotzen, but why you have to go into a whole thing, the difference between Yosher and Chezer, and through effort or no effort, seems to be very tangential, at least initially, when you look at it, Bashkofer Reshena, first glance. So a few points I'd like to make. First of all, in the parentheses we learned yesterday, just a few lines above, you see he refers to a Maimer of Ata Yisrael in volume 1, page 87. So it's a long way back. I would suggest that in general, when the Rebbe Rashab refers to a Maimer before, we know many places he doesn't refer to earlier, even though he discusses the same themes earlier. So when he explicitly gives us a source earlier, it means that there's some deeper connection. It's not just he's giving us, I happened to talk about it before. As I said, there are many places he doesn't tell us that he said it earlier. Secondly, if it's going back, literally, we're talking about almost 1,000 pages ago, it's very clear in the so-called the rules of learning Chassidus, especially, that he wants to tell us that this idea is connected to what he discussed back there. And I pointed this out a number of times, that when he started going into the discussion of Oyer and Yesh, and he brought the whole thing with Rotzen earlier, especially in Tzadik Daled, there was a long discussion about Rotzen. I'll show you where he speaks about it. So there too, he referred to those pages almost 1,000 pages earlier. So it's very clear when you look at all that. I just want to look it up where it is. 1 second. Where was it about Rotzen? 1 second. Yeah, the bottom of page 1147. And 1148. So when you look at the whole thing, you see that he's connecting it to the themes back in volume 1, which that immediately elicits the following understanding, at least to my estimation. That if you go back to the central theme of Ayin Beis, which is interface, the interface between the divine and existence. And if you go back to the earliest Maimorim, the whole Hemshech starts with B'shah she'ikdimu, Yisrael nasav v'nishma, hichtiru lahem, kosheru lahem. God made for them crowns, 3 crowns. Nasav v'nishma and Hagdomas nasav l'nishma. And he goes into Keser. And Keser is definitely the operative word of the interface, as he explains back on page 2 of the whole Hemshech. I'm talking about in the beginning. That the first interface of all is God wanting existence. If there's no want, if there's no desire for existence, you don't have anything. So the first step is to desire. But at that point, in the Hemshech, in the beginning, he went into a whole discussion. What's the difference between Ratzon and the Keiches Pratim? We too have a desire, and we also have faculties. So for over 50 chapters, the Rebbe Rashab explained the first 50 chapters of the Hemshech is all about that. Makif and Pnimi. Basically, Ratzon reveals what the source wants, what the producer wants. Koiches are the instruments he uses. So they're all revelations of Elokus, but it's very different. Pnimi and Makif. Or what he would call later Abligvul and Agvul. Or not later, even earlier. Keser and the other spheres. And there he explained, if you remember, the 3 levels and spheres from number, story, misper, sipur, sapir, a narrative, sapir, an illumination, a transparency. He also gave a 4th level. It's not relevant right now here. We'll talk about it later when we talk about the 4 levels of bittul. And then he said, similarly, in Keser, you have the 3 levels. Keser as it relates to existence, Keser that's removed, and Keser that's completely beyond. 3, always 3, which is always interface language. The source, the product, and the channel in between, like Yesh Ayin, Yesh Al Derech. So the point being that all the theme in the beginning of basically throughout Ayin Beis, but the first half of the first volume was a long arichas about Ratzon and Keiches. So now when he's going back to discuss the central theme of Das Elyon and Das Tachten, the perspective from above and the perspective of below, in order to explain the interface, how God sees it, how we see it. And now we're learning in Eir itself, Kel Deus Avaya, that Eir itself has the perspective of complete bittul, which is what we're discussing now. So it makes total sense that he wants to connect it back to the central theme of the beginning of the Hemshech. So that's the first explanation, I would say, why he's bringing Ratzon and Seichel. It's not just to give an example. It's also an example, obviously, but it's actually part of it's an intricate part of the whole theme of Ayin Beis. Well, Ratzon reflects God's desire. Keiches reflects God's plan, the structure, so to speak, the divine structure. The same thing in the human beings, the Etzem HaNefesh, then comes Ratzon, then comes Seichel, and the other Keiches and faculties. And that's why he said in the parentheses, Ratzon is the level of Ayin. Why is it Ayin? Because it's completely bottled to its Nefesh. And the same thing in the Nimshal, in the moral, Eir is completely bottled to Atzmus. And that's why it can convey whatever Atzmus needs to convey, because it has no identity of its own. Its whole identity is bittul, as we learned also at length earlier. That's one point I want to make. The second thing, obviously, once you know Ratzon and Keiches, it makes it easier to relate to in ourselves. We also have Like I explained, Asher Kedeshanu b'mitzvayse v'tzivanu, al netilas lulav, al achilas matzah. We also see in Avodas Hashem, there's the connecting to the Ratzon, there's connecting to what the Ratzon wants, the specifics. And in the Nefesh, Mepsari Echza Lakah, we have an example now from ourselves. There are things we desire, and it doesn't really mean, doesn't make, and in that context, everything we desire is important, equal. It's an equalizer. And then there's what you desire, the object of your desire. And that's where there are these distinctions. And both are necessary when you want to make a dira b'tachtenim. Because you want to have, on one hand, you want a structure, you need existence. If there were no faculties, if there was no yesh, you wouldn't have existence. On the other hand, you want existence to be aligned with the source, with the highest levels of the source. So you don't want just ayin of the yesh hanivra, you want the ayin of the yesh amiti, which in some ways is a form of ratzon, which also explains the whole discussion earlier about the levels of ratzon as they slowly emerge in Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. Remember? Heskem, Shakvetaria, Hachlota, Ratzon Prati, Ratzon HaKodum. So you see, Ratzon plays a prominent role because it's God's desire. Ratzon Hashem, which is already an expression, not Atzmos, but it's an expression that has nothing but Atzmos, because all it is an expression of what God wants. Okay. So Eir, you can say, is the antithesis of Bchira. Eir doesn't have Bchira. Not only did it choose, does Eir is not just like something that shows what God wants, it doesn't even have Bchira in the first place. Its whole personality is not about choice. It's not about independence. It's about expressing what God wants. That's it, period. The Yesh will have Bchira, because that's where the whole thing plays itself out, the Aveda down below. Now, what about the Er Yasher Er Chezer thing? Why does he bring that? So that I'm not 100% sure about. I'm speculating, and I'll just share my thoughts. I'm thinking out loud that perhaps what he wants to, why he's bringing it, why is it relevant here? Because it doesn't seem to play a role in the Nimshal. Like you don't see, where does it play itself in the Eir? Eir is not subject to Er Chezer. We're talking about Eir Lifnei Tzimtzum, the highest levels of Eir. It's completely bittul. Where is there a Helen Vehester, and where is there a student, or in the case of Ratzon, where do you see a resistance? We have to force him to say Keifenei say Ache Meretzani or Kabbalah Sale. So it seems to not even play a role in the ultimate discussion here about Eir. And yet maybe, and this is just a maybe he's hinting to, and perhaps I'll talk about it later, that at the end of the day, Eir Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, yes, there's no Er Chezer or Er Yasher. All it is an expression of Atzmos. But being an expression of Atzmos, it also expresses all the levels. So later, once the Tzimtzum will take place, and once the Yesh will emerge and be created, and we will do our Aveidim Malmata Lamaila through Er Chezer, that perhaps what he's hinting to is that we can reach into deeper levels of Eir than Eir itself doesn't even know of. In other words, if you're talking about the way Atzmus reveals through Eir and creates existence, Eir Yashar, that's creation, like we've talked a number of times. God creates the world, and this is the process. Atzmus, Eir goes through its different gradations, Ratzon, lower levels of Ratzon, to the point of Shir Atzmei B'Koyach, he allocates the resources, defines, envisions the details, and then comes the Tzimtzum, and then the Kav, and the whole Seder Shtalshus. That's all Mamayla Lamata. That's the creative process. Yes, in an organized way. Now comes our Aveda from the bottom up. We're like the student. We're like the resistance. We are like the Ratzon that has to be forced, because we have now a Yetzer Hara, and we have all kinds of challenges. So through our Aveda, what happens? We can actually access deeper levels of Eir from the Etzem that Eir itself initially did not have in the process of creation. Basically, what we do through our Aveda, we increase and add something that was not there in the first place, at least in a revealed way. In other words, it's basically what the yesh adds into the oir. Perhaps that's what he's hinting to. He doesn't say it explicitly. That's why I'm giving all the disclaimers. But maybe that's what he's trying to say here, that ultimately when there'll be avodah, you'll have the power of the oir chezer that will reach deeper than it's like than it was there initially. The Chassidus explains that the Ma'aseh of tzaddikim, the work of tzaddikim is greater than the work of heaven and earth. How could you say such a thing? What, creation of existence is not good enough? Yesh ma'ayin? Only God could create, and you're saying that tzaddikim's work is greater than the creation of heaven and earth? So Chassidus explains in Tafresh Pei, the Frierdiker Rebbe has a long mimer on it, but it comes from the Alter Rebbe. Beautiful explanation. Why is it greater? Because the Eibishter created Ayin Liyesh, and tzaddikim make from Yesh Ayin, and that's even greater. Because that God could create Ma'ayin Liyesh, my Kamashmalam. What's the Chiddush? Of course he can create. He's a creator. But that a human being, a tzaddik, can take the yesh that God created and turn it back into ayin, meaning to bittul, take a yesh that God created to be a yesh. Like we're learning at length here, that a yesh is completely separate from the ayin, doesn't sense it at all. And we could turn it back into ayin, that's greater. It's a greater transformation. So perhaps that's what he's hinting to with this oir chezer, speaking about a situation. We're not talking about oir as a creator, the creative process, the creative energy of oir. We're talking about the deeper levels revealed through our avodah. Maybe. Okay. So, any questions, further questions on this whole thing? If not, where are we here? We have a few more minutes. I'm not going to go to Habeis now. We're going to go to Tzadik Daled, because Habeis is the second. If you see the next paragraph I mentioned before, Habeis is the second Eifen I mentioned. The first, we finished the first level of Bittul and Eir. The level is called Heder Tfisas Makim, no standing, completely nullified in the presence of its source, quote unquote source. Habeis is going to be the next, and the next page is going to be the third Eifen, is going to be the fourth line, the third line on the next page, 1158. And if you go down, you'll see Hadalad, the fourth. So we're going to learn 4 different levels of Bittul. We've covered 1. But what I would do now is go to Tzadik Daled, which is the Hemshech of the Frierdiker Rebbe said in Tzadik Daled, which is 1933. And there he cites all of this and explains it more at length. Question is, should we begin that already? I don't want to just jump into it without... Okay, but wait. So no questions. Okay, fine. So if you have Tzadik Daled, I'm not going to learn it now. I'm just going to lay the ground for it. Tzadik Daled we're going to learn is in page 115. That's where we stopped. $115. And what he's going to do, we're going to go, I don't remember, did we stop by the beginning of the paragraph? Or middle? I'll look it up before we learn it. Okay, what I'm going to do is stop here. And tomorrow we'll continue from page 115 in Tzadik Daled, which corresponds basically with page 1155 in Ayin Beis. The Eifana Aleph of Bittul, but I think we'll start from the beginning of the paragraph. I'll let you know tomorrow. Okay. So we'll stop here. We finished the paragraph in the middle of page 1157. We're going to go to Tzadik Daled. When we finish that, we'll come back to the Eifan Habeis. So just remember this framework. The second Eifan of Bittul. So we're going to go back to learn the first Eifan. And there's a lot of interesting things in Tzadik Daled. They're going to help illuminate some of what we discussed and hopefully add more clarity.